So good afternoon, everybody. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Dr. Jan van Aert. I'm a professor here in imaging science, but I'm a very proud alum of Virginia Tech. I did my master's and PhD degrees there under Dr. Randy Wynn, who's become famous for his participation, especially Landsat science team meetings and efforts. And then I think, I don't know, Val, how long have you been at Virginia Tech?
Since 2007.
There you go, since 2007. So Dr. Val Thomas joined Virginia Tech in the forestry department, but specifically in the remote sensing component of forestry, to sort of focus, as you will see, more on LiDAR remote sensing and structural remote sensing of forest resources. Now, I have to say that imaging science is sort of strange in that we work on all things imaging science and the imaging chain, but there's a very many remote sensing and other imaging departments out there, right, in the wild. And Virginia Tech is probably on the forefront, if not at the forefront, of a lot of satellite, airborne, UAV remote sensing of especially forest resources, to the point where I believe the forest program and forestry program at Virginia Tech is probably ranked, if not number one, in the top 3 in the country. So it's a very prestigious program. And we're very fortunate to have Dr. Thomas here today to share with us in the work that she's doing, especially, as I said, in LiDAR remote sensing from a variety of platforms looking at forest. So she's a professor in the Department of Forest Resource and Environmental Conservation at Virginia Tech. And she uses LiDAR, as I said, across a range of platforms to assess forest structure, function, and change. And as nerdy imaging scientists, you'll see what she means by function and change soon. But there's a dire need in the sort of ecological and even operational forest environment to assess structure from a perspective of forest inventory, or from an ecological perspective in terms of the function that forest provides as carbon sequestration mechanisms and so on. Dr. Thomas's work has been funded by a variety of federal and state agencies and industry even. She obtained her undergrad degree in environmental engineering at the University of Guelph, that's in Ontario, Canada. Postgraduate diploma in remote sensing from the College of Geographic Sciences, Nova Scotia, Canada, and her MS and PhD in geography, Earth System Science at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. So Val, I really want to thank you for your time and the time that you're taking out to spend online even with us. I wish you could have been here to meet some of our colleagues and students, but we'll make the best of it, and we look forward to your talk. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. We'll consider this like a virtual introduction for now, and a virtual meeting. And I have the chat open here, and I'm also very receptive to people interrupting if you have a question. So please do so, and we can turn things to more of a conversation if things emerge that way. So thanks for the introduction, and thanks for the invitation. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you this afternoon. I'd like to start just by acknowledging some co-authors and collaborators that I work with. So this is not even a complete list, but these are people that have worked on things related to the things I'm going to talk about today, including Dr. Wen, who was already mentioned, and a number of either current or former graduate students. And also on this list are a member, Todd Schroeder here is a member of the U.S. Forest Service, and Jim Rakestraw from International Paper from outside Virginia Tech. So what I would like to do, since I know this group is a very technical group, is assume some technical background and focus on the science reasons of what we're doing and the science related outcomes of what we're doing in our research group and the various things going on. And I'm going to try to pull everything toward these broader themes and why we're doing what we're doing. And so not only am I going to talk about things related to LiDAR, but also other types of remote sensing where they fit in. So I'd like to start by kind of talking about why we're looking at forests in the southeastern US, what's unique about these systems, and some of the big science questions that we're asking, and then the research related to that and the specific technologies and approaches that are appropriate for those questions. So not just the latest and greatest remote sensing technologies, which are things that we like to look at and which are fun and interesting, but also the ones that are most useful for the question at hand to get answers that can help people make decisions at the level of, a landowner or some forest management decision. So let's start with a brief discussion on what's unique about the Southeast, or why we're interested in the Southeast, and some of the questions about it. So this part of the US is very dynamic. It has a very dynamic sort of land cover and land use change trends, I guess is one way of putting it. And is what this image that you see on this slide, this is the global forest change product that Matt Hansen from University of Maryland developed in collaboration with a number of people, including with Google Earth Engine. And it was published in Science in 2013 and is available online, and you can go and check it out. But what you see here is these are the forests of the world. These green areas are areas where they're representing forest cover that hasn't really changed that much. The red areas where you can see big patches of it up here in the boreal forest are areas where there's been significant loss of forest since about 2000. And so, this is forest fires up in the boreal. And then what you might be able to see, I don't know if you'll be able to see it very well on your screens or not, but this area that I've circled here, this is the Southeastern United States, and you see that it's a big purple spot, and that's actually quite unique on this image of the world. It's certainly the biggest purple spot, and it's actually one of the few purple spots. And the purple spot on this particular map indicates areas where both loss and gain in forests have occurred on the same piece of land since the year 2000. And what you're actually seeing there, if you zoom in, you can really see that it looks like almost like little patches of fields. So those size and shapes are because of land ownership patterns in this part of the United States. And this loss and gain that you're seeing is actually the harvest cycle of the southern pines, particularly loblolly pine, which has a harvest cycle of around 20 years or less. So one of the things that's interesting from a remote sensing perspective is that the entire harvest cycle can be seen in the satellite records, particularly in Landsat, which has been collecting at a resolution of 30 meters since 1984. So you can see the full cycle of the forest industry in the Southeast. And that's pretty interesting, because there's other parts of the world where the age of forests is so big, like the trees might be 1,000 years old, that you can't see the full cycle of its growth in a satellite image. So it's interesting in that way, because it allows us to map things related to management. And so this area of the United States is a very productive forestry region. It's the wood basket of the United States. Around 60% of our timber is produced from this area. So it's a very important area, both for carbon sequestration and ecosystem processes that are important for some big sustainability challenges, particularly climate change. But it's also a really important economic area in the United States, and the forest industry is very large. So you see these patterns of land change that we can see from satellite images, from forest to ag, and back again, which is a very dynamic process in this area. So partly because the harvest cycle of forests is so short here, that you can make decisions as a landowner to go back and forth between an agricultural use and a forest use, depending on the socioeconomic conditions in that region, and different policies or incentives that might make you want to make different decisions on your own land. And then we also see in the background these more permanent conversions to develop land, which is a process of urbanization that we usually consider to be fairly permanent, because you're usually putting some sort of impervious surface on there that doesn't easily convert back into a vegetated cover. So because of this big land management signal from the forest industry, one of the things that's interesting is that we have these changes in land cover, but not necessarily in land use at times when we harvest a forest. So for example, immediately after a forest harvest, it looks like obviously the trees are gone, so the land cover becomes different, but it's still in use as forestry, and you plant it and then it regrows. And that causes some challenges in remote sensing modeling and land cover classification, for example, because the land cover is different, but the land use is the same. So there's some big challenges for using remote sensing to make decisions at the regional level or to develop understandings at the regional level in this area. One is just because the area is so large. It's about 30% pine, and I'm going to be focusing on the pine because that's the main industrial species is loblolly pine. So it's a really huge area. It's widely different. It covers a fairly large latitudinal and longitudinal gradient. So there's big environmental differences across the region. There's also no wall-to-wall LiDAR. So many of the questions that we want to ask and answer are difficult because we can't actually map the entire area with LiDAR data and then pull those pieces of information out. And I know that you've had Soren Popescu in as a speaker, and so you're probably fairly well versed in some of the latest and greatest things that you can do with both airborne and satellite-based LiDAR data to answer ecological questions. And so, if someone said, well, what is the remote sensing thing that you really want for the Southeast? I'd be like, well, I would like some repeated wall-to-wall LiDAR coverage. That would be great. But that's not the current situation. And it doesn't look like it's going to be the situation anytime soon. So that's a challenge. The other challenge is we actually don't even know for sure where all the pines are. So our national products for land cover classification tend to be have like an evergreen class. So luckily in this region, most of the evergreens are pines, but not all. And so that's another challenge. The other thing is that management practices such as thinning can cause problems in those classifications. And that's because, you remove vegetation cover, then it looks like something else. So those algorithms pick it up maybe as shrubs or bare ground, when in actual fact, it's just a thinned forest of this with the same height in the stand. So that's a challenge. And then of course, the other thing is this is an area with a lot of individual private landowners, and it's also had huge socioeconomic changes over time, which has caused, for example, certain industrial groups to divest their land holdings and various situations like that. So the forest management patterns have had significant changes. And we don't have necessarily great records for that. So for example, we don't really, even though humans plant and manage the forest, we don't really keep track of that in a sort of standardized way. So it makes it difficult to really know even what's happened, even when we look back in the remote sensing imagery. So this leaves us with some big science and sustainability questions in the region that remote sensing can really help with. So things like the total area of forest and how that changes over time, that seems like a pretty low hanging fruit from a remote sensing analysis. But as I mentioned, like moving that forward is where are the pines and what is the breakdown between natural and planted pines that we could map with remote sensing, and also what are the land management practices that we can see with remote sensing over time. And these have big implications for things like, well, obviously for economic activity, if you're sort of monitoring what's happening on the industrial side, and for biodiversity, for example, because there's a difference between how a natural pine ecosystem or a mixed forest would be for habitat for biodiversity compared to a monoculture, more heavily managed pine plantation, for example. We also need to know how management is impacting productivity. That has big implications for carbon sequestration, and which is important for our understanding of forest resilience and how forests are responding to a changing climate, and how that might move forward into the future. And so there's questions related to that. We want to know trends in disturbance, how that's changing, how resilient forests are to those various stress and disturbances. That would include things like fire and pest and disease. And obviously the management activities are also a type of disturbance. So these are some big questions for science and sustainability, both of forest ecosystems, but also playing into these larger humanity grand challenge sustainability questions of our resources moving forward under changing environmental conditions. Okay, so let's move into some of the research that we're doing with that. I'm actually going to start with something that isn't LiDAR based, but to get at the very first science question that I mentioned. So as I move through this, I'm going to try to bring it back to these big picture science questions to sort of explain why we're doing what we're doing. So one of the things we have been looking at is expanding our sort of understanding of management activities in the region by expanding the sort of regional level classifications to include indicators of management. So right now we like I mentioned in our big national products, we have a classification, for example, of evergreen forests, which, as I mentioned, in this region is mostly pine. But we don't have any indication of how intensely those forests are being managed. We know that the natural pines are not really being managed, or they're being managed at a very low intensity. But there's also a lot of plantations that are at that level of low intensity management, where they're essentially planted and then they're kind of left. So being able to distinguish between those and natural pines has biodiversity implications, but in the context of productivity and carbon sequestration, they would sort of be considered roughly equivalent. They're both being managed at a very low intensity. That's different than stands that are actively managed, where they're doing things like controlling for planting density, they're thinning the forest, they're fertilizing, and they're doing weed control and all kinds of other sort of common management practices. And so thinning is a really common one that tends to be a good proxy for other things. So for example, fertilization is fairly expensive. So people are not likely to invest in fertilization if they're also not thinning. So you can use thinning as sort of a proxy to say, okay, these forests are forests that are being thinned, and therefore there's the high potential for other management activities on those stands, which gives us the potential then to see some of those things from remote sensing. We also in this region have very intensive management of forests, which are sort of genetic modifications and those types of things, but it's a very small portion of the landscape. So it's, if you're trying to look at something across the region, that's not as important of a class. So, doing remote sensing work on this and being able to tease out some of these management intensity questions would allow us to answer some of those, or at least explore some of those science questions on the impact of management on ecosystem process. Okay, so let me just show you the region again. This is sort of, this green area is actually U.S. Forest Service Region 8. So it's a sort of study unit of the Forest Service. And you see that the historic extent of loblolly pine, which is are these areas that are kind of hashed, these black hash lines. That's basically the historic extent of loblolly pine, according to Little in his publication in 1971. And so, there may be some small movement beyond that, based on changing conditions. And then I'm just going to draw your attention to, here's where Virginia is, and these little squares are two big extents of Landsat imagery within Virginia that I'm going to focus on just for a couple of minutes. Okay, so one of the things that we did was, because of Virginia Tech and its extensive involvement with stakeholders in the region and a long history of sort of forestry research in a lot of different levels, we have access to a very high amount of field data. And so in this particular case in Virginia, by law, all harvesting activity has to be reported and then inspected. So this information is compiled by the Virginia Department of Forestry. It's a state agency. And so they maintain a database of harvests and then all kinds of information that they collect at that time. So I'm just going to refer to some records, all of their records from the period of August 1st, 2014 to June 29th, 2017, which is over 17,000 records of harvest. So by accessing this data, it gives us the potential to really look at like a huge validation data set. There's, for the whole data set over time, they're well over this, but 43,500 records, and they're getting better as they move forward and being more complete with those records. And so you can kind of see on this that thins and clear cuts, so a certain number of these clear cuts would be from the pines, and then the thins would all be from the pines, because that's not something that we typically do in deciduous forest. That tends to be more on the commercial selection side. So a big chunk of the database is the loblolly pine that I'm referring to. Unfortunately, that database is not collected with the intent of doing remote sensing analysis. Instead, it has more to do with monitoring harvesting activities for other purposes. So they tend to collect the information and their coordinates for those informations at the loading deck, which is basically the place on the side of the road where the truck comes and then you put the logs onto it. So on the remote sensing, that looks like a big bright response. Right on, no matter what kind of, on LiDAR data, it would be this cleared area with no heights. On Landsat or other types of optical imagery, it would be a big, really bright response from the truck and from the road. So we had to manually go in and adjust the points that we wanted. We selected points from different management classes and then adjusted them to actually fall, the coordinate to actually fall within the forest stand as opposed to at the loading deck, so that we could then relate it directly to remote sensing. So that took us a while. That took us several months actually to go in and do that for 1,500 points. And you can kind of see how they're distributed here across these two big Landsat scenes where you see land cover shown underneath from the NLCD, the National Land Cover data set. And you can kind of see that that these points fall across evergreen forests and also the deciduous forests. And so we basically sampled those points and then labeled them as whether they were deciduous, whether they were pines that were thinned, whether they were clear cuts, which could also include some deciduous, or whether they were persistent pine that hadn't been harvested at all. So one of the things we did then was we used, in this case, we were using Landsat data to develop this new classification. So this was a huge big data problem. So what we did was we developed a number of predictive layers from Landsat. Those would be things like just reflectance, just sort of image reflectance at different wavelengths, whether that be visible near infrared or shortwave infrared. They would be things like vegetation indices, but really we weren't looking at the raw products. What we were looking at was harmonic regression predictors of those data. So let me just show you what I mean by that. So essentially we had all of the Landsat imagery that fell within that time period, roughly 2014 all the way through 2016. And so you have all of the Landsat images that fall within our study area in that time frame. So it gives you a number of points to draw from. And in this particular case, what you're seeing is NDVI, and then they're reorganized by day of year, where 0 would be January 1, and then you could follow it out to the end. So, you know, here where my mouse is, you have the peak of the growing season. So this top line is how NDVI responds for an area that has not been harvested. So it responds sort of like you would expect vegetation to respond on NDVI, where you see, even for needles, you see a decrease in needles in winter. And then you see an increase in summer in the peak of the growing season. For deciduous canopies, that would be even more exaggerated because you have a loss of leaves and a gain of leaves. But for evergreens, what happens is they drop needles, but they still have some. So you can see that here, where you can see that the points roughly follow that trend that you would expect, that harmonic trend that's very classic for vegetation. Then what you see is for the areas that are harvested, this orange one is thins and this gray one is harvested, like completely harvested, clear cut. What you see is it deviates a lot from the expected pattern of vegetation, which makes sense because vegetation has been removed, and it deviates more for clear cuts than it does for thin. So these are all logical responses of vegetation over the period of a growing season. In fact, in this case, over 3 growing seasons, and you would expect to see that vegetation that's been disturbed would no longer sort of follow that classic expected pattern of a nice, lovely peak and a tight fit around your curve. You see a decrease in that entire vegetation response, and you also see scattering all over the place. So the fit is no longer very good. So we can use both the parameters that describe the shape of these curves. In this case, it's just a Fourier regression. And so you can pull the parameters off of that. Or you can also base it on the fit of the curve itself. So the RMSE and the R squared of the actual curve. And those are also things that you can map and then use as a predictive variable. And then there's, of course, any other thing that's derived from Landsat. So things like the global forest change product itself can be ingested into these algorithms. So once you start dealing with all of these types of predictors, you start to move into a big data challenge where you could, download all the imagery onto your own computer and then use your scripts to do it. And we've done that. Problem is it takes forever to do that. And any of these giant stacks, where in this case we had like 44 layers that we were investigating, it can take a lot of time to process those. In some languages and processing environments are more efficient than others. But it really helps if you can sort of take the algorithm to the data, which in this case was enabled through the use of Google Earth Engine, because they have the entire Landsat archives stored on there, and then you can generate and run these algorithms to do harmonic fits and this and that right within Google Earth Engine itself. So by doing that, it enables something that might take hours and hours, and now you can just kind of like watch it go for each Landsat scene. It just really fast. So that helps a lot, and sort of a big data challenge that in this case was enabled by Google Earth Engine. Okay, so then you can use that to develop models. And in this case, we developed a 10 variable model so that we could then apply it to the much broader landscape. That had quite a good classification accuracy to pick out thins. So now we're not only do we know where the evergreen forests are, we know where they're being clear cut and where they're being thinned, so that we can have a better understanding of forest management. And you can map that, in this case at the state level. And you can kind of, it's hard to see at that scale, but when you zoom in and compare it to air photos, you can kind of assess whether or not it's really working. So in this case here, you see this little dot on a persistent pine, and you can zoom into sort of air photos and whatever else that you can find and realize that works out pretty well. There's no evidence of harvesting here. Here's an example of a clear cut and the corresponding air photo that shows it was clear cut actually around 2014. And here's one where it was thinned in 2014, and you can see that shape also on the image. So it's working pretty well. You can then take that, and using sort of high performance computing, you can expand that to the broader landscape. So you can go back in time with Landsat well before 2014, all the way to the beginning of the Landsat archive if you want to, and then apply it for the whole region. In this case, again, enabled by Google Earth Engine. And by doing that, we can also then validate and correlate it to huge industrial harvest records that we've been able to collaborate with an international paper for to understand what actually happened historically. So international paper had a lot of land across the southeastern US that they divested in 2006. So they have this huge, really rich database that we can use to do some of this historic remote sensing analysis that would not be possible otherwise, because you obviously can't go back in time to collect data. So that's a really valuable source of information there that can tell us not only what their harvesting activity was, but all of their management decisions on that land. So it's a really rich data set. And by doing this and going back in time, we could potentially have a 40-year record of management activities, which we can then summarize at the regional level. So here's an example of mapping that across the region. Here you see that extent of loblolly pine, and you see harvesting activities from 2014 to 2016. So this is within the area that is classified as evergreen, mixed, or woody wetlands from these national products. So that's where the pines actually are. You see that most of it wasn't harvested during that period. That makes sense. We don't cut everything in a 3-year window. And then of what was harvested, about 10% of that was clear cuts, and 15% of it was thins in that time period. So we can now do these assessments over the full time period. We feel more confident, obviously, the closer we are to now with records that are a little bit more easy to verify. But we can go back in time and we can assess these trends over time to get at some of those big picture questions. Okay, so that's what is out there and how it's changing. But the other thing we really want to know, and this is how I was introduced actually, as is the structure and function. And this is really where I really like to explore things. So building from what I just talked about, we then want to know, what are these patterns of growth, for example, which structure can tell us, right? Changing in heights and various things from LiDAR data as an example. We want to know sort of what is that pattern? How is that changing? And, LiDAR provides a really great way of looking at that. So the problem being that, as I mentioned before, we don't have LiDAR for the entire region. So that makes things a little challenging, but that's where we would start. Right, so we start with LiDAR data and we start with Landsat data, and we can put those two together to look at productivity. So the way one of the ways we look at productivity and how that changes is to look at things like site index, for example. So for those of you who aren't foresters, site index is just a term that describes how tall a stand is at a given age. So in this case, it says on these equations, the base age is 25 years. That means how tall is that forest stand when it's 25 years old? And then a stand is more productive if it's taller by the time it reaches age 25. That's essentially what site index means, and it's an indicator. It's an indicator of forest productivity. So there's a question, assume very little forest leaf trait. Okay, yeah, okay, so here we go. So assuming that your background is not in forestry. So so this is what we're interested in knowing is how quickly do forests grow? The reason why we want to know that is because we're interested in a number of things. How resilient are these ecosystems? So the reason we want to know that is how quickly can a forest recover if it's disturbed, for example. In this case, the disturbance is often harvesting of forests. But we also want to know how productive they are in terms of carbon sequestration, which is also very much related to some of these concepts. And so forests that are more productive are going to sequester more carbon. So that's really important for understanding questions about response to changing atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations, for example, because at least for a certain amount of time, that would tend to help forests grow more. And then we have projections about how it would decrease that ability as environmental conditions changed even further. Okay, so we're interested in trying to map these things for remote sensing. So this is a giant equation that describes that. But if you look at the equation, all it's really asking for is some understanding of the dominant height of the forest, which just essentially means the height of the taller trees, the base age, which is set, and then the age. And so we can get age from Landsat because we basically know when it was harvested from the Landsat change products, and that basically makes time equals 0. And then however many years it has been since we noticed that it was clear cut is its age, right? And then we can get the heights from LiDAR or other things. So I know you already know about LiDAR data from your own work and also from presentations you had previously in the seminar series, like from Soren Popescu a couple weeks ago. So I am assuming that you've seen some of that data. So I'll just tell you that in the Southeast, we don't have wall-to-wall, as I've mentioned, but here's an example of the types of LiDAR acquisitions that we have. So what we have is, in some cases, we have statewide acquisitions, and in some cases, we have little chunks within the states that might have LiDAR acquisitions for the time period that we're interested in. So in order to do sort of a regional assessment, you can't really make a regional map, but you could do an assessment of how this is changing in a general sense from a sample using the disparate data sets that we have. And so, that involves a lot of challenges because there's different acquisition parameters, et cetera, but we can essentially relate metrics that we've derived from LiDAR to field measurements of height on the ground to develop these relationships that then can be applied to to everywhere that we have LiDAR data to get maps. And so if you look at that, all combined, we can get the age from Landsat, we can get the heights from wherever we have LiDAR, and then we can get an indication of productivity, which means how well the forest is growing in that area. But keeping in mind that we don't have wall-to-wall LiDAR, and we really want heights wall-to-wall, that would be like optimal for understanding how forests are growing. We are looking for other strategies. So one of the strategies is, can we take these sort of cutting edge LiDAR analysis techniques and apply them to what's a much older technique, which is photogrammetry, right? So now we have potential opportunities using digital photogrammetry to take digital imagery acquired from planes, if they're acquired in certain ways, use the overlap on those air photos to develop point clouds that are similar to LiDAR. And I'll show you how they look compared to LiDAR in just a second. We have had that technology for many years. In fact, we had it much longer, at least from a manual point of view, with stereogrammetry, much longer than LiDAR data. But in 2018, we have a product in the United States called the National Agricultural Imagery Program, which collects growing season air photos for the entire country, and they're digital photos, and they include infrared. So basically they do it on a 3-year cycle. So every state has, every 3 years, you can get these data. So as part of sort of an experimental program in 2018, different federal agencies, mostly the Forest Service, but also others, paid additional money to extract more information from those products than we typically get. And so it allowed us to get point clouds for at least 12 states, and in some cases even more information, full stereo information. But the states that we're interested in have point clouds, and they also have raster-based models of the surface that were derived from those point clouds. So that's Virginia, Tennessee, and North Carolina. And what's exciting about this is if we can get it to work, then we can get heights at the state level every 3 years if we continue to invest in that program. So let me show you what that looks like compared to LiDAR data. So you've probably seen some LiDAR data in the last couple of weeks. So that would be these green points here. These are from airborne LiDAR platforms, in this case over the Mountain Lake Biological Station, which is near Virginia Tech. And it's a mixed deciduous, this particular plot is a mixed deciduous plot, but we also have it for the pines. And then these are the points derived from the digital photogrammetry technique. So you can see that, this is from air photos, so it doesn't penetrate and doesn't provide you that information that LiDAR gives us, but we don't need that to get height. All we need really is some estimation of where the top of the canopy is, as long as we know where the ground is. So taking those same techniques that we use from LiDAR data to model from the points from air photos, we can get models of height from the air photos. So, we did this experiment. We had over 600 plots that included deciduous and pines so that we could map forest height across those 3 states. Here's, example of what that looks like. So LiDAR models are usually, roughly in this ballpark, as are the NAPE. And so, we expected it to work, and it did work, so that's good. And here you see this one on the left is a little bit more messy. This is because these are different ways that we measure height in the forest. So dominant height means you're getting the height based on the height of the tallest trees in your area. Average height means you're getting the height based on all of the trees, including the little ones that are like below the top of the canopy. So average height tends to be lower. And average height, and when you think about how you would predict that from LiDAR, would be predicted from metrics about LiDAR that have more understanding of penetration into the canopy. Whereas mean dominant height, which is the top heights, are related to things where you look near the top. So in this case, we're looking at metrics from the NAPE data, which are only on the top. And so you can see here that there's a lot of different sites, and this includes both deciduous and coniferous forests. And so we're basically, the long and short of it is, we can map heights from these air photos and then get statewide maps of height. And then we can take that to the next level and get age from Landsat. And so, you know, we can get age from Landsat just from those products, time since disturbance. You'll notice I circled some areas here. These are the areas where thinning occurred and where the Landsat product gave it an artificially young age, because the Landsat product got confused because it was thinned. It thought it was something else. And so it basically thought it was clear cut when it wasn't. But now, because of the work I already just told you about mapping thins, we can go back and correct for that and fix it, because we know it's actually just a thin or just a harvest. Sorry, in the case of a complete harvest, it's going to be age equals 0, and that age would be correct. But in the case of a thin, it thinks it's a harvest, but it isn't, and we can just fix that. Okay, so that allows us to then apply those models and get estimates of site index. And so right now you can see that there's a little box around this. We still have to go back and do these region-wide corrections for the thinning that we can now map from that other project. Okay, so that's structure. A couple other things about sort of structure and function. So the next thing that we can do, okay, before I say that, I say, as we map this across the states, that's another big data problem, where we're having to use high performance computing to apply these point cloud maps to very large regions, because they're talking now about terabytes of data to cover those 3 states. So that's something that we're using at sort of high performance computing environments at Virginia Tech to do. Okay, so then this combination of structure and function, one way we can do that is to look at leaf area and its changes over time. So this is essentially the amount of leaves in a forest and how much of the ground, if you were looking from above, how much of the ground is a cover, or if you're looking from below, it's sort of like, it's basically like if you take all of the leaves in an area, like a pixel or a stand or something, and you calculate their area, what would it be? The surface area of a leaf. And we care about that because that's the area upon which photosynthesis is occurring, right? So there's ecological reasons why we want to know that particular metric. And it's something that's well studied from remote sensing data. And if you combine the sort of research that we're doing by looking at the trajectories of leaf area over time, we can study things about the impact of management on recovery and on resilience of forests. So what do I mean by that? Here's an example of a model using Landsat data to look at leaf area. So this is just a simple model. It uses multiple sensors of Landsat data, in this case 7 and 8. Reasonable like strength of the regression, or like R squared of 0.8 or something, and a fairly low RMSE. Because it's Landsat based, you can apply it across the entire region, and you can study it based on, you know, hardiness zones of plants, which are related to the climatological and soil conditions. And so basically we can then go back and extract for these stands where we have harvest records from international paper and other sources. We can extract the entire post-disturbance trajectory. So that means after it's been clear cut or after it's been thinned, what happens to the recovery of those forests, and how does that change based on management interventions, such as if we fertilize or if we don't fertilize. So that's an example. So this is what those trajectories look like by basically extracting the entire 16 years worth of Landsat data, which is a huge big data problem for all of these different stands. And then we can apply some sophisticated data analytics techniques. In this case, we used a generalized linear mixed model with a spline fit, and we took difference curves. So basically we took the mean response of fertilized areas and unfertilized areas over time. And what you see on this output, and these are based on different stratifications, soil by hardiness zone. So what you're seeing is if the line and the little sublines are greater than 0, so if they're above this red line, for example, there's a significant difference caused by management. So we can sort of look at how different climatic and soil conditions combined with management are likely to impact the recovery or the trajectory of a forest ecosystem after they're disturbed, which has pretty big science implications. And okay, so the very final thing I want to broach is these other explorations of structure and function, which have more to do with the combination of both LiDAR data and hyperspectral remote sensing or UAVs. So another thing that we can do, so everything I've talked about so far is largely pushing toward these regional maps. But the other thing we want to do is really look at the temporal response of forest ecosystems. And to the extent that we can generalize that regionally, we want to do that. So one of the ways we do that is what we look at these flux towers. So the United States has these towers. You can see an example of one here going up from the forest. We have different networks of these towers all over the place. They're basically micrometeorological towers that are collecting measurements every so many seconds ever since they're established. And so they're collecting things related to carbon dioxide flux, for example, and then all the sort of micrometeorology and light information that would come with it. So we can use these as sort of sample or validation sites to understand ecosystem response over time. And they're strategically located across the landscape, and it's supposed to be representative of those forest types so that you can then scale based on your understanding of those forest types. So this is an example of a flux tower in a loblolly pine plantation. So what we want to know is how do these forests respond to different stresses, and can we see that with remote sensing so that then we can understand it. So here's an example of data that comes off those towers. So what you see here is these are two different measurements. This is carbon dioxide flux in the blue, which is an indication of whether like how much it's photosynthesizing, and then you see incident radiation in the kind of brown color. So in a day that a forest is not stressed, we know that carbon dioxide flux kind of follows the same pattern as the incident light, because light is a driver of photosynthesis. So since we know that, we can just look at this graph and know that there's times when the forest is stressed, which is right here, right? Where the carbon dioxide flux doesn't match the incident light at all. So then we can sample those throughout the day to see if we can see that with remote sensing. So I'm going to just quickly describe a UAV experiment to do that. So this is within one day. I showed you before several days. So this within that one day where that arrow was the carbon dioxide flux, and I fit a Fourier fit to it just to smooth out some of that variability. And these colored dots are times when two different UAV acquisitions occurred. So we did 6 acquisitions, sort of morning, noon, and afternoon, with 2 different sensors on the drone. Okay, so that's carbon dioxide flux, and this is light use efficiency. So this is how efficient is a plant at photosynthesizing based on the light that they're getting. And because this is a stress day, I already showed you that, it's not very efficient at noon, right? And that's what you saw when you saw the nice incident PAR curve on that original graph, but the CO2 flux is only about halfway through it. So, this is what you expect, not very efficient, right? So you can use these drones. You can fly over the site. You can collect really, really high spatial resolution data. You can take those data and you can calculate indices because they're little multispectral sensors in this case. You can do the same exact process with hyperspectral imagery and get like as many bands and indices as you possibly could want. But in this case, we just calculated a number of indices based on the 2 drone systems. And then we can use that data to do things like we can model the shadow component of the canopy, and you can do those models based on structure from motion. You could do a similar approach with LiDAR data, for example, because you have a surface model at the top of the canopy. And so you can model shadow and sunlit pixels, and also how that might vary throughout the day if you want to. Or you can also do it just from the reflectance data itself by setting thresholds of response, for example, from panchromatic bands, or however you want to do it, and get a certain amount of shadow and a certain amount of reflectance. So what you see here is on the left, this is the sort of false color image. This is just the image. And then on the right is the shadow and sunlit components. And you can kind of see how, how they match up. Okay, so once you have the shadow and sunlit component, you can use that then to look at responses based on those different components. So from those drone acquisitions and the indices that we created, you probably don't remember because I blasted through it pretty quickly, but there were a couple of indices that were in common across both drones. So I'm going to show you the results for one of those. So this is an index, the normalized difference red-green index. That's just a vegetation index calculated by the red and green bands. And this is their correlation to the carbon dioxide flux measured from the tower, the Fourier fit of that carbon dioxide flux measured from the tower, and then the theoretical maximum, which is basically the carbon dioxide flux that follows the incident par, which coincidentally is also the most likely value that you'd get from satellite data based on how they're doing their CO2 models for some of these larger 8-day products, for example. So what we want to know is, can the drone information and knowing information throughout the day and at this resolution, can it give us a little bit better understanding of when the forests are stressed and not behaving as we expect from some of our modeling efforts, so if you can, that means that you can get better and more information from the drones. That would be an improvement on what you could potentially download from some 8-day product or whatever. So what you see here is that you do see increase in some of these fits, particularly, so here, that's right here where my mouse is, when we divide the canopy into its sunlit and shadow components, which is telling you that LiDAR or structure from motion can provide a lot of useful information in that. And then here you can see this is only 6 points. So I wanted to actually put the graphs up here for you to see it, because you have to have some skepticism when you have n equals 6. It's not a very good number. So, you know, that's sort of the direction that we're going, is like expand this analysis, get more data to see how much of that we can really get from these targeted drone acquisitions that could help us use both structure and function to really understand ecosystem processes over time. So to wrap this up, this is a very dynamic region. It has really, there's a lot of important science questions that we are asking that are important for concepts of sustainability, and that includes all types of sustainability, not just the environmental component, but also the economic and the socioeconomic dynamics of sustainability because of the forest industry. So we have, you know, a lot of sort of just natural ecosystem science questions, but we also have this huge involvement with land management. So there's a lot of important science questions that come out of that. And because it's such a large region, it has a global impact. So an impact on our understanding of global carbon dynamics, so which makes it really even more important to understand the impact of management. It's one of the only places in the world where it's that big. So remote sensing can help provide some of those answers, but it requires different technologies, the willingness and desire to use, you know, not just LiDAR data, which would be great if we had LiDAR data wall to wall over time, but we don't. It also requires all sorts of other remote sensing, both satellite-based optical imagery and all the way down to airborne and drone platforms to get at these big questions that we want to know. So, you know, I've sort of evolved into a remote sensing scientist that uses whatever tools are needed to answer the real questions that we have, as opposed to focusing on the technology, which is kind of how I started out with my career. And so all of that needs to be combined with like really extensive ground measurements, which in the Southeast we have, because we have industrial cooperators, we have various federal agencies that are interested, federal and state agencies interested in forests. And then we have a number of university collaborators that are all sort of collecting data and looking at these questions and sort of pooling our resources to move forward. Okay, so that's where I'm going to stop. So I appreciate the opportunity to chat with you, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thanks, Val. That was very interesting. I really like the applied angle as well. You know, so it's been a while since I've seen so much forestry. So it's actually been really refreshing. I've sort of left the mothership a little bit for some precision ag stuff and so on, but this has been very, very interesting. So I'll first open it up to some questions from the floor. Anybody with a question out there? Quiet as a mouse. I'll maybe start while folks are regrouping. So I was really curious about, and I think it's really cool, the sort of juxtapositioning of LiDAR versus photogrammetry, which is obviously, as you said, a pretty established technique in forestry, and now we call it structure from motion, in the fancy computer vision term. But have you looked at any of the type of scaling sort of trade-offs between the spatial resolution and photogrammetry? Where's the sort of breaking point for where you can still say they get good, say, stand and even regional level type estimates as you say reduce spatial resolution for photogrammetry-based solutions?
So it's really that's a really good question, and it's really so. Scaling toward the regional level in some ways is a little easier with that data. It's the other direction, as you kind of alluded to, where the digital photogrammetry techniques leave you sort of wanting. So that the point density of the LiDAR data is very high in comparison to what you get with the NAPE data. So it's really at the level of the stand and the plot where you start missing information. So for scaling, it's actually a little easier to use the photogrammetry because you're interested in sort of broader trends like height and how that changes across the region over time. But at the plot level, we're more interested in trees and how they kind of fit together and sort of gaps in the canopy and maybe how the leaves are changing across the vertical distribution, and none of that you can get really from the NAPE or any digital photogrammetry, structural motion kind of thing.
Yeah. So I see Dr. John Carrick John has his hand raised. John?
Yes, very good. Thank you for the presentation. Very interesting. I was just curious, and I'm sorry if you said this and I missed it, if you have considered looking at planet imagery or other sources of higher resolution imagery. Some of these systems collect imagery from slightly different views, and I don't know if this has been tried or not, but if there's a potential for some of the stereo aspects to be used with the higher resolution imagery, or if it's just maybe good enough in some other way to complement some of the more traditional sources. I know Planet had a program for free imagery for research purposes. I don't know if that's still going on, but I was just curious if you looked at that at all.
So it's a really great question. And the answer is yes, we are starting to look at that a little more closely. And so there are other things emerging as well. So Planet is a really great example, and the high spatial resolution opens up a lot of possibilities because we don't have a lot of things like that from space. There are some challenges with it. So we're really at today I was sort of presenting more like the sort of a plot where we're at a level where we can answer a lot of questions, whereas the work that we do with Planet and some of these other sensors is really much more proof of concept at this stage. But yes, I do believe that that's going to be a big player as we move forward. Another thing that I didn't mention at all, but is like right now on the space station, we have a hyperspectral satellite. Well, it's not really a satellite, it's a sensor on the space station called DCIS, which there's also a lot of research opportunities there. And so that's a really another good sensor that it has pretty good coverage across this part of the world. It's also obviously following the tracks of the International Space Station, just like the JEDI LiDAR, which I'm not sure if Soren talked about that one, but it's just like that. So it's a sample. It's not a wall-to-wall map, but it does, just like Planet, it does offer some new and exciting opportunities from space. Yeah, really good question. Well, I see there's a couple of questions in the chat. So one of the questions was, how do you measure carbon dioxide uptake in real time? So that's measured off of these towers. So these are eddy flow. They're basically micrometeorological towers, and they're based on the theory of eddy covariance flux. So they're measuring carbon dioxide, energy, and momentum, sort of the three-dimensional components of these fluxes at different heights above the canopy, and they're based on their understanding of sort of turbulent motion and eddy covariance, there, and also the environmental conditions like the wind speed and direction at the specific time of the measurement. They understand where, or at least they have an understanding of the footprint from which that measurement that they're taking, like every so many seconds, and then they're averaging it for a half an hour, which forest part around the tower it's coming from. So these are well-established field sites that you can download data from.
If I can interrupt, it's something I stress with the imaging science students a lot. You know, I think of imaging science quite a lot as tool makers. You know, the students learn a lot about imaging science, photon capture through optics onto detector planes, image formation, algorithm development. But all of you as imaging scientists eventually will work in some sort of application domain. And I think this is one of those key examples. I sort of slyly messaged Val and said, listen, assume very little leaf trait and forest structure background information, because I think it's really cool when you look at specific disciplines like medical imaging, forestry specifically. Forestry is renowned for the use of remote sensing in management and research and ecology. And I think something like this, where Val was just explaining the whole Flux Tower setup, it's absolutely mind-blowing, the type of gas flux measurements that are out there ready to be coupled and already being coupled, as you can see, to remote sensing measurements. So that's really, really cool imaging sciencey problems that folks like Val are already tackling at Virginia Tech and elsewhere. So anyway, just a little mention. I see there's a question from Tony as well, Vodacek.
Okay, so the first question is about Landsat 8 with its finer spatial resolution for identifying things. And yes, okay, so our best models include the panchromatic band from Landsat 8, which is that higher spatial resolution band that you're talking about. And Landsat 7 has a panchromatic band as well. But then when you move further back in the record to Landsat 5 and before, they don't have that. So we have developed models for both scenarios. And so when we try to apply our models back in time, we have to use ones that don't use that higher resolution band, obviously. But for moving forward, we have actually found the panchromatic band to be, that higher spatial resolution, to be very valuable. And then the second question was that there's a great deal of fire, natural and managed, and how does this impact your assessments and classifications? And that's another really good question. So it does look a little different on the remote sensing, but it's something that we're looking at right now. So the forests, this is one of the reasons why we're using sort of the harmonic regression fit to try to understand the patterns that emerge from these management activities, which are a little different than some of these natural disturbance. But the other thing that we also see are these other periodic disturbances that come across the landscape and that you can kind of see they cause a very different signal. Tornadoes and hurricane damage and pests are other ones. And so in the case where they cause a loss of canopy, like a firewood or like a storm would, it can potentially cause confusion in those classifications. And right now we're sort of looking at what is the extent of that confusion. So yes, it can impact it. Is I guess a short answer to that. It can show up as a disturbance, and so if you force your classification to only have 3 classes, which is clear cut, fins, and non-disturbed, then you have to force it into one of those classes, or you can create an additional class for other types of disturbance.
Any other questions? Well, Val, thank you very much for taking some time out. I'll sort of officially end the session now and stop the recording, but I just want to thank you again for taking time out of what is a busy COVID schedule for most folks. And if you don't mind, maybe as folks dissipate, sticking around for another few minutes in case there's someone who just wants to have an additional discussion, I'd really appreciate it. So
sure.
Thanks,
Well,
Val.
thank you for joining me this afternoon. Appreciate it. Appreciate your questions.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see each other around, I hope. So with that, I'll sort of end the session and stop the recording. And if you want to hang around and have an additional discussion, no pressure. But if you do want to, I'll keep the session alive for a while bit longer. Thank you.